the Jews that attended that were just European Jews. They were not Jews from Asia, Jews from Africa, Jews from South America, even Jews from New York or United States. So it's quite a miracle. And the miracle of it that I want us to see tonight is that God packaged it in such a unique way. God gave Ezekiel four visions in his book. The first one was a vision to call Ezekiel to be a prophet. The second, but that's chapters 1 through 3. The second vision that God gave Ezekiel was that Jerusalem would be destroyed, chapters 8 through 11. And then the third and fourth visions are third is the one we're going to study tonight. The fourth vision is the one we're going to study next week. The third vision God gave was a vision about Israel being restored, chapters 34 through 37. And then we're going to go 39. And then the fourth vision was Ezekiel's vision of a new temple, chapters 40 through 48. And we're going to study a section of that last week. We're going to ask ourselves, why would God restore Israel? First, the vision of the restoration of Israel and what it is and what it does mean. Chapter 37, as we looked at last week, explains what God is showing to Ezekiel. Ezekiel is still living in a land that's free. That's interesting. Israel had not fallen yet. Now, Jerusalem falls the day after Ezekiel gives this prophecy. Jerusalem is besieged, but they're still a free town. And the temple has not been destroyed yet. And yet God takes Israel in this vision, Ezekiel in this vision, and takes him to a valley littered with dry bones, very dry bones. It's not a place that has life, it's just filled with death. We are not told the rest of the landscape because the vision was just this plentiful and very dry bones. In fact, there were so many that Ezekiel makes reference to this large quantity twice. First, he calls it a valley full of dry bones. And second of all, as he looks at it, he says, there was a great many dry bones. God has not only given the vision to Ezekiel, God's in the driver's seat. And he asked the prophet a pointed question. Son of man, can these bones live? Now we know, separate and apart from the power of God, the answer is a big, clear no. It is beyond human ability to take a valley of dry bones and bring life back to them, no matter how many things we've seen. DNA cannot be recreated to that point yet. This is something that only God can do, and really no one can argue that restoring a valley of dry bones to living human beings is not within the capability of any person. But I want us to see something about that teaching that puts it in context for each of us. This really was on my heart this week, and so I want to share a personal testimony in this as well. God had just had Ezekiel tell the children of Judah their nation would fall. Jerusalem would be captured. The temple would be destroyed. Now, that's about as bleak as it can get for an Israelite. When they heard this, I'm sure that they were defeated, disappointed, and crushed. Their whole life was based around Jerusalem and the temple. Most of them went to all of the feasts at the temple every year, all 7. Every male was required to go to 3 of those feasts every year. They took their offerings to the temple. They took their sacrifices for their birthdays and for their family to the temple. The temple, even though if they may have lived 100 miles away, the temple was their social life. It was their religious life. It was all these things that they're doing. So when I heard this, I'm sure they were defeated and disappointed, just crushed. What they had based their life upon would all be gone. Then God asked a question that Ezekiel gives some hope and some hope to the people listening. Can these dry bones live again? I wonder if that's a question that God wants to ask some of us tonight. Maybe you have a strained or a non-existent relationship with one of your children. And in your mind, it can never be restored. Maybe it's a grandchild or maybe it's a close friend. Perhaps God is saying to you, well, that is true if you only want to consider what people can do. You're right. It's not able to be restored. But with divine thinking and intervention, his relationship will get better and maybe can be completely restored. This may be the very prelude that God is using to get you to see that he can intercede, he can resurrect, and he can restore a relationship that is dead. Some of you know, maybe not all of you, but my brother Howard was an alcoholic. And Howard was an alcoholic who lived a very difficult life, especially when the alcohol took greater control of him than he had of it. And he lived a very disappointing and died a very lonely death, basically by himself in a trailer on the outskirts of Billings, Montana. When he was first married, he brought his wife, Sandy, back to Illinois to see all the family. We were thrilled to see her. He had met her in Colorado while he was in the service and she was working there. And the only time we all got a chance to meet Sandy was at the wedding in Webo, Montana, her hometown. I would put a little footnote in. Do not go to any wedding in Montana on December 28th, any year, any time, any way. It is the stupidest thing we ever did. I had a GTO that had to sit in the garage for 3 days to just be able to run it. And on the way home, we only had like a 4 foot patch in the middle of our window that you could see out of. The ice was so thick on the side windows that we had to have scrapers to scrape it inside to see out anything outside. It was crazy, crazy. But anyhow, we all went out to Webo. We were glad to see her. And now they were coming back to Illinois. Well, they were going to stay with us for a few days. And I was able in those few days to make him so angry that he took his wife and went down to my parents' house. And he started a 35-year estrangement with me. We had very little contact with each other and almost no interaction. One time during those 35 years, Sharon and I had attended a church conference in Anaheim, and we had persuaded him on his terms to let us visit. We had to meet at a restaurant, and after we were approved, we all got to go up to the house. The only time that the cousins actually met each other from the time they were small children until the time when they became later adult children. In those 35 years, many things went wrong in his life. He left his family and moved to Alaska, primarily because all Alaskans get tax money. He was totally estranged from his wife, ex-wife, and his 3 children. He never contacted them, wrote one letter to his daughter, no letters to his son, and no letters to his ex-wife. He met a woman in Anchorage, Alaska, that was also in AA, and they had a disastrous marriage because as soon as they got married, they quit going to AA. He finally moved back to the town where his ex-wife lived beside one of his children, Billings, Montana. He was forbidden by this child, his middle son, to make any contact with his ex-wife or his son's family. He could no longer work. Drinking and a reckless life had ended his ability to work. And he lived off of a very small inheritance he'd gotten from the estate of our father and mother. It was sent to him in small increments by an older sister. I felt that we would never have a restored relationship because I knew no way to ever make it happen. It was truly a valley of dry bones with no life left in them. I contacted him and found that he had a financial need. He asked me for a certain amount of money and I mailed him a check. And I left it in the hands of God. A few months later, to my great surprise, he called the church office. And Louise said, "Your brother's on the line." I said, "Really? I only have one brother." But I wanted to say, "You're kidding, what brother?" But she said, "Your brother's on the line." And we connected and began a very new relationship for the last few years of his life. He would never let me visit him, but he did come to Phoenix and spend about 3 weeks with Sharon and I one time. And he would never let me call him. Every number he ever gave me was a disconnected number. But he would call the office, usually a little drunk or a little high, and flirt and carry on with Louise for a while before he got on over to talking to me. And God had taken a 35-year valley of dry bones and brought some life back to them. I just want you to know that God has a way of resurrecting things that seem impossible for us to ever see any way anything's going to happen. Perhaps there are other areas of your life that are filled with dry bones. Maybe there's a financial obligation that you just feel like you never have enough money to pay. Maybe there's some legal issues with members of your family that has become a real problem between you through the years, but it doesn't seem like it ever gets resolved. Maybe it's a sin that you have felt that you could never overcome. The sin always seems more powerful. And perhaps the Lord is asking you, can these bones live? I would say if it's on your heart and it seems that God is communicating with you, make the first move. Seek God to help bring those dry bones back to life. Well, Ezekiel is very faithful in giving the message that God had given him. And so when God says, "Would these dry bones live again?" Ezekiel says, "God, you alone will know." And although those listening did not see the vision fulfilled that God had given Ezekiel, they didn't see all the captives come back from Babylon to Judah once Babylon was conquered. They only saw a part of what Ezekiel showed in his vision. It still happened. Everything God says will happen. It was 1948. It was not 550 BC, but it did happen. It was a remarkable scene that God showed Ezekiel, and Ezekiel shared with the people. Now, we looked at last week exactly what he was to prophesy to these bones, but I want to put it in a little different framework tonight because I want us to see that the next part of this story is really a carry on of this story of restoring Israel. He says, first of all, the bodies will be restored in perfect form. They'll have no life, they have no breath in them, and they will not have the Spirit of God in them. And we know that those are two essential things. You can't physically live without breath in you, and you can't spiritually live without the Spirit of God in you. So he said that's the first thing that's going to happen. He was God telling Ezekiel that all who would read the passage that Israel would come together in two stages. Stage one, there would be a desolation would end, and the desire would that they would want to come back to this homeland. Some of those because of persecution, and we know that many fled Germany, Austria, Poland, Russia, the Ukraine, even Yugoslavia and Romania, places where there were Nazi camps and persecution going on either by the Nazis or by Stalin in the Ukraine and Russia. Some were just feeling that they didn't belong to the land that they were in. And although perhaps their family had been there for a millennium or certainly centuries, they felt a call to go to Israel. And still others could not put a real reason why they needed to get back to the land of their ancestors. They just knew they were compelled to go. Now, I want you to realize what that means. There were wealthy Jewish people who had beautiful homes in downtown Manhattan, who had fabulous jobs, who went over and lived in kibbutz, a communal farm where they went out and worked with their hands to grow crops and plant trees on the mountainside and drain the swamps of the area north of the Sea of Galilee simply because God had put it on their heart to go to Israel. I don't know about you, I got off the farm. I really don't have a desire to go back and do any of those a whole lot. I would do those if God said I had to. It's not something I'm volunteering and getting my plane ticket right away to rush over and do all these agricultural by hand work. And then God would restore their nationality. When Babylon destroyed Judah and Jerusalem, that was the first time that Judah had not been a national country since Joshua and the children of Israel had conquered a portion of the promised land. It was not God would rekindle the hope and desire to live in the land he had set aside for them. And then God would put together an unbelievable series of events that would lead them to establish this new nation. It's clear that God felt the nation needed to be restored, but first the Israelites needed to be resurrected to a moral life that God had taught them to live. Now, I think that's kind of interesting. That would lead to a restored nation. You see, when the Israelites went into captivity, they were religious but immoral. When they came back to Israel, they were moral but irreligious. But to establish a country, you don't have a lot of people talking about their faith and not living it out. You got to have the people committed to one another and committed to the goodness of the country and people that don't have crime on their minds and people that are wanting others to be established. So the restored nation of Israel was not started as an overtly religious nation. Most were either atheists or agnostics, but they were moral people, and the crime rate was low. The esteem value of each person was high, and the care for each other was intense and bonding. It still is. Many are attracted to citizenship in Israel just because of how the Israelites hang together and work at being a single nation. God had put into his spirit in them, and although very slowly they've turned to faith, They have more backbone to create a nation, the moral backbone to create a nation that would last. The other major theme of chapter 31 was the unity of Israel and Judah. Now, this seems really far fetched from today. I mean, all we've ever known since 1948 is Israel. It's been one country. It's fought against the Arabs. It's fought against some of the Muslim nations. It's always had the Palestinian issue to deal with. Really, unless we are Bible students or read our Bible a lot, Israel and Judah are just nothing to us. If we're looking at modern day Israel, they're not even things we think about. But God said the two nations would never divide again, and they would never become two nations again. Can you imagine what God is saying? The disruption that started among the sons of Jacob. Well, let's start a little earlier. The disruption that started among the wives and the handmaidens of Jacob and carried over to their sons led to a lot of things happening. There was bitterness. There was the jealousy between the brothers that allowed them to sell their own brother Joseph into slavery. And that was a compromise because several wanted to kill him. There was attempted murders. There were many divisions in the land. There were civil wars between the tribes. The false gods that grew out of their division. When Israel tried to be different than Judah after they split off, they worshiped all kinds of false gods. They had great golden calves at the entrance into Israel where people worshiped and followed these golden calves. And God says, no, when I restore Israel, all that will be gone. God would restore Israel just as it had first started. Israel united, purified, following one leader. I feel God is giving us this lesson for the United States right now. I would encourage you to pray for God to restore the United States to a spirit of cooperation, a sense of brotherhood, and a desire for all to move in a way that blesses God and his people. Like Israel, when they started, the United States, when it started, did not always get things right. We became a nation and still allowed slavery. We did not allow non landowners to vote. Our first elections were only for landowners. And probably most derogatory, well, slavery was pretty bad too. We did not let the women of this nation vote. When many things happened in our nation that corrected some of these, and they have changed. I wouldn't say corrected, they have changed through war, through protests, and through the vote. But the real key to leading a nation and being a nation that brings glory to God and others is to be unified in desire for all to be able to advance, to see each child of this nation as a bundle of opportunity, and to have a bond and a care for others that makes our nation strong. Well, once God had given this message to Ezekiel that includes the final celebration of life in the millennial kingdom, and that's where we're going to go next week because Ezekiel's going to tell us about this restored third temple. He's going to tell us about the layout of the land, which is different than any layout of the land has ever been. Old Testament tribes, Revelation tribes. It's going to be totally different in this millennial kingdom. It's going to be led by King Jesus, the son of David, as the restored monarch. He comes back with a restored temple and a new covenant. He then focuses the next two chapters, and this is where I really want us to focus tonight, on a large and merciless force of nations that comes to attack Israel. The timing to me of where God puts this prophecy to Ezekiel is amazing. Ezekiel, he's saying to him, Israel's going to be a restored nation. Now, we know as soon as they were a restored nation, the Arab nations, 7 nations, declared war the next day. They were in a war for their life within 24 hours of being declared a nation. Huge nations, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. These nations immediately attacked them. But that's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about these original Arab nations attacking. He's talking about a time in which will trigger towards the last end days, in which Gog and Magog lead this tremendously large military force to sweep into Israel and to gain all of the plunder that they can from Israel and Jerusalem. Now, you might say, well, what kind of plunder would they have? Well, Israel's technology is amazing. Not only their technology in IT areas, not only their technology in farming areas, not only their technology and advancement of salt water purification, their advancement of use of minerals. Uh, there are many things to plunder out of Israel that are probably more powerful than silver and gold. And they will come to sweep down on a nation. Now, I want to put this into context for just a moment, okay? Why is this message a part of restoring Israel? Because God, when God has promised, when He restores Israel as a nation, it will never be captured or destroyed again. Even the Antichrist will not destroy Israel. And we need to realize that God is saying, okay, now I'm allowing Babylon to let you go into captivity because even though you're religious, you still worship false gods. And even though you're religious, you've combined immorality into your religion. You're using all kinds of immoral ways, running around with foreign women, in spite of the fact you have wives, just on and on and on. He said, so what I'm saying to you, yes, you needed to go into captivity now. But when I restore this nation and it has a moral foundation to it, it will never fall again. It's such an emphatic point that God illustrates the extremes to which He's ready to go to make sure that happens. So He pours out through this prophecy what will happen in this tremendously one sided battle. Now, it's one sided from the world's view because you have dozens of nations going against Israel. But it's one sided in the prophecy because you have dozens of nations going against Israel, who's led by God. And what we need to realize is Israel never fields an army. They never fight in this war. This prophetic war is fought totally by God. He starts by having Ezekiel condemn those who would come to attack and destroy this restored and united nation. That's in chapter 38. It starts with a condemnation of Gog and Magog, used here and again in Revelation 20, verse 8, when again they will be a part of the very end of times. We know these are adversaries from the north of Israel that have come to attack and ravish the land and its valuables. They will have a northern force of several nations, and its coalition of nations is targeting Jerusalem as the point of their attack. Many have seen this group as all sorts of names. I'm just going to say tonight that Russians and Turks are always in that mix of names that I read, hear others talk about. And also with that, many Western European or Western Asian countries are in that mix. And then it says they're led by Gog, probably a prince of Magog. There was never a land called Gog. So we probably need to see it as Magog, the country, Gog as their crown prince. They're joined by Persia. Now, this one gets a little easier because modern day Persia is Iran. And they're joined by Ethiopia, which is representative of the Northwest African nations, which would include Somalia and Yemen and some of the Muslim Nigeria, some of the Muslim leaning nations that would be certainly willing part to see Israel plundered. And they're also joined by Put, if you have a King James Version, Libya, if you have a New English Version, or the North Central and the Northwestern areas of Africa, Algeria and Liberia, and perhaps even Morocco. However, if we might kind of get into a little bump here. So I want to give you a little prophecy background, okay? The absence of forces from right around Israel has troubled many, and many who don't believe in the literal reading of these prophecies have said, well, that kind of shows that we're talking about a ring of nations around the known world. You've got Russia, you've got Turkey, you got Iran, you got Africa, and so it must just be saying the whole world is against Israel. Well, I want us to look at the fact that I believe Psalm 83 is real, and that the war between Israel and its neighbors has already been fought. Now, if you'll read in Psalm 83 later this week, you're going to see that those nations are very common. They're Moab and Edom and Jordan and all of the countries, Lebanon, Syria, all the countries right around Israel. And as you see in Psalm 83, they are conquered. Israel conquers them. And we're going to see, I think that this is certainly a great part of what happens. Therefore, when they have conquered them, the opposition against Israel is going to be minimal. The walls will come down. There will be no walled cities. The gates and bars, it says in Psalm 83, will disappear. The people will live at peace with their neighbors and others. Because if you'll read Psalm 83, it says they know God is on Israel's side, and nobody really wants to refight that battle. This great attack, not as large as the attack in the final battle of Armageddon, will show that God is intentional in what he had Ezekiel prophesy. It will be a time in which they're vastly outnumbered. Let me just read what the scripture says in Ezekiel 38:15. It says, "You will come from your place in the far north, you and many nations with you." Iran, all those side nations, African nations that we talked about. "And you will come riding on horses." Now, whether those are horses or tanks or just military movement, it's going to be a great horde, it says, a mighty army. "And you will advance against the people of Israel like a cloud that covers the land." That probably is speaking in my point of view of the aircraft and the Air Force and all of the military expertise that's going to be able to be brought against Israel. God has had Ezekiel to tell the people this is unlike any invasion they've ever seen. The invasion of the Babylonians and the Assyrians were used by God to cleanse the land of Israel. That's what we normally think of God doing. And then to punish the people for following false gods and living in immoral ways. But this time, God is bringing this vast army into the land of Israel to show that God is the God of the restored nation and to punish these nations that continue to try to destroy Israel. And he will defeat whatever enemies come against them. Beginning in chapter 38, verse 19, God begins to list all the things he will do to fight the battle for the Israelites and make them victorious over this vast armed enemy. The list is amazing. It's daunting. First of all, there's going to be a giant earthquake. It's not going to be like the earthquake in Revelation 16:19 that occurs in Jerusalem and changes the topography of the world. It is, and all the cities of the world are destroyed, but it is an earthquake that is going to affect all of Israel. And it will rattle and disrupt the invading armies who have all camped on the mountaintops of Israel. You say the mountaintops? Well, yes, the Golan Heights, Mount Hebor, Mount Carmel, on and on. The north, we're coming from the north, there's a series of many, many mountains there that the people will have. It will disrupt nature. It says the fish, the birds, the domesticated animals, and even the creepers, those crawly things on the ground, will all be disrupted by this earthquake. Most of all, it will cause panic among people because it's going to reshape mountains. It's going to cause cliffs to just be mounds of rocks. And every wall that has ever been built will collapse. God will then cause these enemy armies all on mountaintops of Israel for reasons of strategy to become distracted and distraught, and they will begin to kill each other in their confusion. God will add to that plagues, probably a series of pestilences that attack the human body. Think of some of the plagues in Egypt. There was the plague of the lice, there was the plague of the flies, there was the plague of the boils. All of these affected the human body and kept the human body from functioning right. They will come against this vast army, and in the end of chapter 38, it says it will create bloodshed and death. So whatever these pestilences are, they're fatal for some of the military soldiers. And God will follow that with an intense torrential rain, producing floods, large hailstones hard enough and big enough to injure and kill troops, and finally fire and brimstone, burning sulfur, or the ultimate force of judgment from God, because it not only kills, it leaves the area covered uninhabitable. God will do this by his divine intervention, and it will not include an earthly army that will oppose these enemies of Israel. God then in chapter 39 continues to have Ezekiel tell these people who are falling as a nation right now how much God is going to defend Israel against this huge tyrannical force that comes against them. And God is going to vanquish those who have followed Gog and Magog. His protection for the restored nation of Israel is total. And the defeat of those who opposed Israel and set their sights on plundering Jerusalem and all that Israel possessed is described in even more detail. God will protect Israel by disarming, then destroying these invaders. He will then have them fed to carrion birds and carnivorous animals. And he spends a lot of time in 39. You may want to investigate those verses too much. They're going to fill them with flesh, mostly with fat, and get drunk on blood. All these who have fallen under the hand of God will simply be food for the animals and birds who feed on dead carcasses. And they have all fallen under the hand of God. Then Israel will begin to burn these weapons that were left as the armies were destroyed. It will be 7 years worth of fuel, the wood, the metal, all the things that were a part of the military will be able to be used for them for a variety of fuels. Who knows? That might even be nuclear fuel. It could be a series of other things that are going to be a part of this destroyed army. And then God will have the Israelites sweep through the battle areas, collecting the bodies so that he'll cleanse the land and bury them in the valley of Hamon-Gog near the town called Hamanah. And the rest of time on this earth, even through the last few years of tribulation, it will be known as the valley of Hamon-Gog, the dead from Gog and Magog. After the bodies are all buried, you'll have the same group go through the land, and every human bone they find, they will mark it. It will all be taken and buried in the same valley, so the land will be cleansed. And there will be no trace of this godless enemy in the land of Israel. It will be as if they never existed. This remarkable battle that God won for the nation of Israel will have a strong effect on the world. First of all, the nations will realize that God is the true God and that he is the first and only needed line of defense for the nation of Israel. There will not be a move against Israel again until midway through the tribulation, when the Antichrist begins to get his forces together and once again wants to destroy Israel. All nations, even Israel, will see that God allowed their nation to go into captivity early to correct their ideas of the worship of idols, the commixing of immorality and worship. But Israel will see what God has done, and they can come to worship him without shame or doubt. They will become that faithful people that Paul spoke about in Romans 11:26, when he wrote, "At that time, all Israel will be saved." They will be totally restored, it says in chapter 39 of Ezekiel. And not another Israelite or Jew will live in any other part of the world other than Israel, and God's Spirit will rest upon them. This great love story, told over 3 chapters, tells us that God did not forget Israel. He never could. But instead, he corrected them when they were needed. And when the time was right, he brought them back to him and protected them through all eternity. I said last week that 50% of all Israelite Jews who have received Jesus as their Messiah have done so since Israel became a nation in 1948. That's pretty remarkable. Now, let me just say that again to you. 1/2 of every Jewish person who has also accepted Jesus Christ as Messiah has done so in the last 70 years since Israel became a nation. I want to share a testimony of one of those tonight. I found it. I don't take Israel Today. That was where it was first written. It was a testimony by a man named Dr. James Tour. And unless you are in his field, you probably don't know of him. But Professor Tour is a professor of material science, nanoengineering, and computer sciences at Rice University in Houston. He's considered one of the world's top synthetic organic chemists. He's authored over 700 scientific papers, holds more than 120 patents. He's been named a host of things. And in 2019, he was invited to speak in Israel's largest Orthodox Jewish university. It is called Bar Ilan, located in a Tel Aviv suburb. His topic was nanotechnology affecting our world. Well, after presenting his scientific paper to everyone's surprise, he suddenly launched into a presentation about his religious faith. What he shared proved to be astounding. He started out, so I want to tell you my story. I'll tell you what caused me, a Jew born in New York, to make the faith decisions I made. What drove me to this? What happened in my life? I don't know all the philosophical things or all the theoretical issues. I can only tell you what happened in my life. In 1977, I enrolled in Syracuse University, and I was doing laundry in August of that year and was talking to a young man in the laundry room. I knew that he was on the Syracuse football team, so I said to him, "Are you going to play football when you graduate?" He said, "Oh, no, I'm not good enough to play pro ball." He said, and I said, "Well, what are you going to do then?" He said, "I don't know, maybe lay ministry." And so Jim Tour at that time, Dr. Tour now, said, "Well, what is lay ministry?" And he said, "Well, it's kind of like missionary work." And Tour says, I thought to myself, missionaries, it's 1977. We have TV. You don't need missionaries. TV can tell you everything and it can get it anywhere. It can go anywhere. Why do you need to have missionaries? And he said to me, if you don't mind, I give you an illustration from the gospel. And that is exactly what he did. He began by saying a verse from Romans 3:23 to me. He said, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." I looked at him and said, "I'm not a sinner." He said, "We didn't talk about sin in my Jewish home." Said maybe once or twice a year, God got into some discussions. But I told the guy, I said, "I'm not a sinner. Never robbed a bank. I never killed anyone. I've never done anything disastrous. How can I be a sinner?" So he read me another verse. "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in her heart, in his heart." Pow, he says. That really hit me. I was an 18-year-old man, but I tell you, I've been addicted to pornography since 14. I worked at a gas station at Hutchinson River Parkway going into New York City. And I lied about my age, but they didn't check papers in those days. They were just glad to have somebody clean the parking lot of this filling station. But the traveling salesmen who were leaving town threw their salacious magazines out in the parking lot that I cleaned. And I gleaned all of those and took them home. And he said, I quickly became very addicted to pornography. And so he said, I didn't think anybody knew. So when he read that verse to me, this man, meaning Jesus, from 2,000 years ago, called me out. And it just hit me. Of all the verses from the Bible for him to read to me, that was the first day in my life that I realized I was a sinner. Something happened to me. And then he led me to a few more verses. Let me just share a couple of them. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and not of yourselves. It's a gift of God, not as a result of work, so that no one may boast. And he said, people try a lot of good works to get to God, but you'll never get to God that way. It's never sufficient. God is holy and we are not. And then he read another verse. But God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. I never thought of this before, Mr. Tour said. People, he said, in my elementary school that I went to, everybody was originally Jewish. Then they bust in some African American kids from the project, but I thought everybody was either Jewish or black. I didn't even know that this was a claim on the table about Jesus loving people before they were still yet sinners. Then he described how Jesus would provide the way to God. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. I thought, how can anyone believe in a physical resurrection? And how believing this will it get me to God? But on the night of November 7th, 1977, I was all alone in room 1812 in the Lawson dormitory on Syracuse University campus. My roommate wasn't there. I got down on my knees. I said, I don't know why I did that. Every Jew I'd ever seen pray stood up. Every Christian I'd ever seen pray sat down. But he said, here I was down on my knees. And I said, Lord, I'm a sinner. Forgive me. Forgive me and come into my life. Forgive me, Lord, and give me a chance to start over. And all of a sudden, he said, this peace began to fill the room. This burden of sin that I felt I'd been carrying just began to fall off. And I thought somebody was in the room. So I opened my eyes, but there was nobody in there. The presence of God had so filled my room, I just started weeping uncontrollably, which was very unusual for me. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I just enjoyed God's presence for a while, and I didn't tell anybody. 2 weeks later, the guy who had first shared with me in the laundry room came up and said, Jim, did you receive Jesus into your heart? And I said, I think I did, but I don't know. Why do you ask? And he said, because I've seen you several times the last 2 weeks and you are always smiling ear to ear. I remember asking, how can I remain close to God? And he said, I've asked people who stayed close to God their entire lives, do you read the Bible every day? And they say, yes. And then I ask other people who seem to drift away and not have this impact on the rest of their life. And I say, do you read your Bible every day? And they say, no. And Jim said, well, that I can do. And I started a practice shortly after that of reading the Bible from beginning to end. And when I'm done, I'll start again. No in a hurry. I just say, Lord, speak to me in the passage I'm in today. Speak to me. So here's a summary, he said, told this group of students and scientists. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men, instructing us to deny ungodliness and worldly desires. You see, he doesn't leave us in our immorality, he instructs us to deny ungodliness, worldly desires, and to live sensibly, righteously, and godly in the present age, looking for the blessed hope in the appearing and glory of our God and Savior, Christ Jesus, who gave himself for us to redeem us from every lawless deed and to purify himself a people for his possession, zealous for good deeds. He draws us to these good deeds. He then concluded his story. He said, I'm going to leave you with a verse from Ecclesiastes chapter 12. The conclusion when all has been heard is fear God, keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment and everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. This applies to every person. To every person, this applies to him or her. God will bring every act to judgment, but the whole idea behind this is that if you want mortality, you've got to get God. Trying to do this on your own is defeating. You'll be defeated. What happened to me that night on November 7th, 1977, is that something changed inside of me. I've never been the same. That's my story. Thank you. What a powerful testimony to give to the largest Orthodox Jewish university in Tel Aviv. God is at work, and he is doing conversion even in the midst of having restored a moral nation. Take heart tonight. God did not forget Israel. He will never forget you. You are extremely precious to him. Well, I want to invite you to join us next week as we conclude our study through Ezekiel and to look closely at what the spiritual impact will be on the world when Israel is restored. It's not going to just be a blessing for Israel. It'll be a blessing for every believer. I would encourage you to study Ezekiel 40 through 43, the third temple of Ezekiel. I don't encourage you to try to understand it all. I just encourage you to study it and to see that it's unlike any temple that we have ever seen in this world. Chuck, let me turn it back to you tonight.
You're muted.
Tell everyone to mute.
Thank you, Tom. Another good lesson. I got from that, that everything God says will happen. I think that's something we should all keep in mind, and
Amen.
especially in those areas of dry bones in our lives. I appreciate your testimony on that, because we do all have connections that probably we've given up on, and that now we should have some hope, at least, that God can resurrect those things. So
Amen.
thank you again, Tom. We're going to stop our recording now, and Linda's going to take us through the prayer time. Thank you.